Obviously, we're pretty late entrants into the carbon clincher game, and everyone was saying, you guys have got to do this. We're buying these products and testing them and finding that, they could handle no more heat than what we were selling in our tubular product, which we knew could be warped from heat. The difference is heat warping a tubular makes the brake pads pulse and is annoying. In a carbon clincher, that can lead directly to catastrophic rim failure. In the clincher tire, you've got all the air pressure pushing out against the clincher bead. The tubular, the rim is really just supported by geometry and the glue, but the tire itself can withstand its own air pressure. In the clincher, it's the rim is handling all the air pressure along with the tire. So when you start to heat that structure, the whole thing can come apart. And if the bead fails, the tire comes off, and if it's a catastrophic blowout, that generally leads to a pretty bad situation.
The braking was probably the biggest hurdle we had to overcome. So we really invested a lot of money in a state-of-the-art brake test machine, and really just had to come up with the design ourselves. There's nothing that you can go to a company and say, hey, I want a machine that tests brakes, and I want to measure the heat and measure the force, the stopping force and all that stuff. It's not like a ready-made machine, so we basically had to develop it from scratch.
We wanted to be able to replicate some of the common scenarios. What we have is a machine that's got a 380-pound flywheel. It's a large diameter, high inertia setup that allows us to replicate basically descents up to approximately 80 kilometers per hour. We have our FLIR infrared camera that allows us to have down to the pixel resolution in terms of the temperature across the entire wheel, so we can track any number of parameters.
What is the temperature that the rim needs to be able to withstand that you essentially cannot, surpass the TG of the resin? Is that number, 300, 350, 400, 450 Fahrenheit? Nobody knew. There was no good science, there was no good studies, there was no good testing, so we really, probably all the way back in 2005, 2006, really started pushing to learn what that temperature was.
Look at the pads, look at the rim, watch it dynamically as it's braking. Funny thing is, when we were qualifying the rims in Europe, it's one thing we didn't know until right before we left, that the camera at which we bought was like military grade, and we almost made the mistake of going through customs with basically like contraband, like stuff that you can't travel outside the United States with. But here we are, a wheel company, and we have to, buy the high-end stuff that the military uses, basically.
You can't just use high-temp resins because those tend not to be tough. Highly toughened resins make great tubular rims and great handlebars, but they can't necessarily handle temperature. A lot of the things that you might dope the resin with that will give you one feature comes at the expense of the other. We sat with probably every major composite resin vendor in the world and sat with them and said, no, we want both. You have to understand, I want A and I want B, even though they come at the expense of each other. In most cases, I need them both. And we were really unwavering in the specs that we had for this system. And finally, we found a vendor, actually a small vendor, that specializes almost exclusively in Formula One. We've got resins today that can, with a glass transition temperature in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than really anybody else. You think that's a tremendous amount higher. The development team, for lack of really good empirical data on how much energy, how much temperature a rim needed to withstand, we started looking at what tubes and tires could withstand. If the rim can last longer than the best of the tubes and tires for temperature, then we're at a good place.
We set out to do this, and we're like, well, we really don't want to use compressed air, really, because whenever you compress air like that, it's going to make a loud boom, and it's going to maybe a little more dangerous than we really want, because we don't know. I mean, we're going to be 200-300 psi, right? So it's a lot of air to have in a tire. So we decided to go with kind of a water solution.
300 doesn't make a noise, so that's a 300. Whoa!
Now we have a new enclosure, a little more controlled test, a little more accurate. Now we'll see we can take a tire up to approximately 400 psi. The limiting factor that we're finding now is in the Kevlar bead tires. We'll actually tear the Kevlar bead out of the tire, typically when you exceed about 375 psi.
The rim that we are manufacturing and producing today can withstand more energy and more temperature than the best tubes and the best tires can handle for temperature resistance. And so I think that really puts it in a place where you can push these rims as far as you can push aluminum rims in terms of break heat, both temperature and time duration of actual heat soak. You can go every bit as far, do everything you would to aluminum, and you will not face a rim failure, which is something that really has really been the Achilles heel of carbon clinchers up until now. Traditionally, we've all been guilty of envisioning a rim, kind of a 2D section of the rim in the air, and we always think of the front half. And I think that's led our whole industry down this NACA profile path. And for background, the NACA is a government body that was founded a long time ago to standardize airfoils and to standardize airfoil behavior. And so I think people thinking of the front half of the wheel think NACA profile. And way back in 1991 when Zipp did the first carbon deep section rim, we were also thinking NACA profile. And that V-shaped NACA profile rim of 1991 in Zipp's world is really the same rim that everyone else is building today. And where the NACA argument starts to fall apart is, you can open the handbook and we own the computer code, so we can run the code, is that, there's not a single airfoil in the handbook that has a bicycle tire as a leading edge, not even close. And so when you overlay the bicycle rim and tire with the NACA profile, what you realize is that a bicycle tire would have to be about twice as tall at the same width as it is today. And the reality is, you couldn't make that tire, and if you could make that tire, you couldn't ride it, you couldn't corner on it, you wouldn't want to ride it or corner on it. The first rim shape that abandoned NACA was, I think, 1995-96 season with the hybrid toroidal shape. And we really just stepped away from that and said, look, we just can't actually make a NACA shape because we've got this tire. And we were thinking in the early 2000s, really we're focusing on the front half of the wheel, and the back half of the wheel is that same shape backwards. But we really weren't able to do the study at that point to really optimize for that. And so you flash forward a ways, Michael gets this kind of wild hair that, hey, let's really look at this back half and see if we could make a back half leading edge that was a good trailing edge in the front half. And so he made a couple of rapid prototypes, and we took them to wind tunnel. They didn't work at all, but they had really unique behaviors at like 1 or 2 wind angles. So we found we could really make curves, we could make drag curves that looked nothing like we'd ever seen.
We always try to describe these things as different rim shapes, and it's very hard to communicate amongst us like which shape you're talking about. So I started the practice of basically naming the shapes, right? So, and what do you name rim shapes as? So basically I started naming all the wind tunnel prototypes after different birds. And I drew up this one shape that I called the Firecrest. And really that was its name, is the Firecrest. And it was totally different than anything that we'd ever drawn before. And you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, it just has a really blunt nose. Well, really, it's a lot more complex than that. It's a pretty complex profile, much more complex than our original stuff. And we put it in the tunnel, and basically our jaws dropped. I mean, it performed so well, and it performed well with lots of different tires. It performed well with 20mm tires. It performed well with 23s. It performed well with 22s. Like, all across the map. First we tested it in the 404 shape. I mean, that's kind of where we were testing at this one particular test. I'm like, whoa, this is big.
You test and run, and the wind tunnel is terribly monotonous, and it really is like watching paint dry. And you go in and change the wheel, and then you stand around for 15 minutes. There's not a lot going on. We put the Firecrest in and ran it and saw the data and said, well, doesn't seem right. I mean, it's a 58mm rim. It was a small variation from the Warbler or the whatever had run before it. And we really thought maybe something was just not right in the data, so we ran it again, and everybody started looking at each other and saying, "Oh my God, that is really fast." And we came out of that knowing that we had produced a 58mm rim in plastic that was faster than the 808 tubular that our pro teams were racing in the Tour that year. I mean, we were that good that quickly with this shape.
And then as we started really exploring the possibilities, we found that, wow, it really works on an 808 shape too. I mean, it really does wonders for controlling the air around the ID, particularly when the ID is working as a trailing edge, so that we really were optimizing the back half of the rim.
Realized that, you know, we could completely change the way the wheel handled with some of these shapes, and a lot of it was being driven by this leading edge of the back half. You know, it was really a total change in thinking. You know, we were still saying, okay, we're going to make it as fast as we can possibly make it, but we were really just beyond enthusiastic about this stability concept. And so what happens is, you know, a traditional wheel, if a wind pushes from, you know, say your left, if it's pushing you right, as far as your front wheel is concerned, it's steering you to the right. All of those consequences are having the same effect. They're all making you go right. And the idea here was, as we pull it back, the wheel actually, ever so slightly, is wanting to self-correct. And what we've been able to do is pull the center of pressure back behind the hub till that it's pretty much right on top of the steering axis. And you know, one of the things our pro riders kept coming back to us with, you know, I think Baden Cook, he'd been on the wheels for 6 or 7 months. Of course, they have no idea what they're on. We don't lead them with these things. You say, hey, ride this, tell me what you think. And his comment was something to the effect that it feels like it rides within the wind instead of against the wind.
So as we were analyzing the Firecrest rim shape, that's one of the things we noticed, that this rim shape, by optimizing that back half of the rim, was really doing a lot of things very favorable to that center of pressure. It really helps with the whole stability of the rim, especially in windy conditions. So when you're out, even though you may be tempted to run like a 303 on a particular day because of the gusty winds, with the Firecrest rim shape, you possibly could run a 404 or an 808. For our triathletes, for our pro road race guys, that's a big deal. Like, I can go from a 303 on a day that I would typically ride a 303, I can go to a 404 or 808. It's just that much more energy I'm going to have at the end of the day.
We actually had rim tools cut, complete dimpled, beautiful production quality tools of the old rim shape. Complete, I mean, ready to go to production as we were learning this. And once we learned it, we had that painful meeting where we sat and stared at each other and put the number on the board of what those tools cost. And there's a lot of digits in this number. and we're all staring at it going, that is a lot of money. But all of a sudden we knew this thing that we didn't know 6 months earlier. And it just felt like it would be criminal to not push forward with that. So we completely restructured the project. We just changed everything. We kicked off new tooling, and then right there that day, the team kind of committed to each other in that room that we're going to make this thing happen. I mean, this is a completely new way of thinking about things.
So it's this mad scramble to get the new Firecrest product to Kona. But we wanted to get the fastest athletes in the world on the fastest race wheels in the world. And we ended up arriving in Kona with about 13 sets of Firecrest wheels, mostly 808s, a few 404s. Macca McCormick, his agent, came in to our service course, or our shop we had set up there on the island, and picked up the wheels and took them back. And he came back the next day and he said, hey, Macca thinks the wheels look great. He loves the decals, but he usually rides the 1080 and he'd like to ride that at Kona. And we told him, we told Scott, we're like, no, he doesn't. He wants to ride the new 808. This is a faster product, it's better handling. We want him to have every advantage possible. at Kona. So Macca rolls out on the 808 Firecrest tubulars for, you know, the Ironman Worlds in 2010, and you all know the rest of the story. And he attacks on the second half of the bike leg with a few others, and obviously had enough on the run to win the race by attacking Raylert in the last, you know, half mile of the race. But I think that was, obviously, we couldn't ask for a better debut of the product.
We knew we had something that was, quite honestly, magical. I mean, it was an absolute game changer, in that these were not only the most aerodynamic wheels we had ever produced, they were the most aerodynamic wheels anybody had ever produced. At critical yaw angles, more aero by huge margins, huge margins. And on top of that, we managed this breakthrough in handling. So I mean, they were the most stable wheels we'd ever produced or created, and the most aerodynamic at the same time. I mean, it really was kind of lightning in a bottle.